Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Right, boom. Welcome to the Stoa, everyone. I am Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And for those of you who are new at the Stoa, sometimes we call it a digital campfire, sometimes we call it a communal podcast. We have a wisdom gym here, and it's basically a space where we have Zoom events, essentially. We started when COVID first came online, and we probably have around 400 events thus far, all have been for free. And we have an amazing guest like Daniel Schmachtenberger, James Cars from Finite Infinite Games, and even Noam Chomsky's coming on in November. And it's sort of becoming a hub, this kind of like indie hub of sense making that all the cool kids come to escape the culture war noise. And today we got Bret Weinstein coming in. I gotta play that hype sound next time, the hype horn. So Bret is here today, and he's gonna talk about Unity 2020. And our MC for today is everyone's favorite Blackbird, Raven Connolly. So Raven will introduce Bret and kind of question and answer protocols. And Raven was a former student of Bret too. I don't know if people know that. They were at Evergreen together. So that's an exciting Stoa trivia for everyone. So that being said, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves. Please don't abuse that function, and I will tag Raven in.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. Great, yes, I am a former student of Bret's at the Evergreen State College. And for those of you who don't know, Bret has a PhD in evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory, and is a professor in exile from Evergreen. And he's the host of the Dark Horse podcast and the mastermind and advocate for the Unity 2020 presidential campaign, which is what we are here to talk about today. So just before I hand it over to Bret and ask him a few questions, we'll go over the question and answer kind of protocol. So I'm gonna ask Bret a few questions to get us going today for about 25 minutes. We'll have a little bit of a back and forth, and then we'll move into question and answer with the audience, where you can put your questions for Bret in the chat, and then I will call your name. You can unmute yourself, ask your question, and you get one back and forth with him. So thank you so much, Bret, for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this.
Yeah.
Whoa, that sounded like there was an echo.
Oh,
maybe it's gone. Okay, good.
great. Just yeah, I don't hear anything, so it should be good.
Good.
So Bret, let's just get to the basics. Start off, everybody. What is Unity 2020, and why is this an important movement for this particular political campaign?
So Unity 2020 is a proposal that I unveiled most prominently on Joe Rogan's podcast. And it's basically an attempt to defeat the central argument that the duopoly uses to keep us all prisoner. So the central argument is the lesser evil paradox. That is to say, you have to vote for whatever the duopoly is offering you, because if you offer something else, you will tend to empower the party that is farther away from what you want. You will draw votes away from that which is closer, and therefore the system will move away from your desires rather than towards them. So that argument has kept us captive for, well, basically for most of my adult life. All of those of us who would entertain some alternative to the toxic and corrupt duopoly always seek for something over in third-party space, and it never works out, and we're always told that we are betraying our values. So the proposal is to draft two candidates, one from the left and one from the right, and to draft them under the agreement that they will govern together as a team by consensus once elected. The person at the top of the ticket will be chosen by coin flip. After 4 years, their positions will reverse, and the person who was in the role of president will run for the vice presidential slot and vice versa. And this can continue until somebody has been president twice, at which point they would have to be replaced with a suitable alternative candidate, and that could go on indefinitely. The idea, of course, is to challenge the corruption that has overtaken our system and give people a choice to vote for something patriotic and decent. I laid out three characteristics that would be required of all candidates we would consider drafting. They have to be courageous, they have to be capable, and they have to be patriots, and nothing else. So that's the proposal, and we are now fairly deeply into this process. We went through nominations. We had more than 1,000 nominations submitted. It turned out that the top 6 happened to divide evenly between left and right, and were far enough away from their next nearest competitors that we held a ranked choice vote for the 9 possible tickets you could assemble, and our top ticket ended up being Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw.
Very exciting. So something I've noticed as I've been researching Unity 2020 and watching your live streams is that at the core of this, there seems to be some very strong principles, and that your process for how this whole thing has been designed and unfolded, the organizing itself, like what you just described about how you even came to select these candidates, is rooted deeply in these principles. Can you talk a little bit about the principles at the core of this cultural movement and how that is kind of the core motivation for what you're doing with Unity 2020?
Sure. I think there are really 2 principles. One is we're doomed, and 2 is that's bad. So anyway, this is an attempt to avoid doom because it's what we're built for. And in some sense, you know, if I put the jokes aside, the people who are drawn to the movement really do believe that the Republic is in grave danger, and that the collapse or disintegration of the Republic would be a huge setback, not just for Americans, but for people across the West and possibly the whole world, because in some sense, the power vacuum that would be created by the collapse of the US would open the door to regressive regimes, and is really potentially an existential threat to our way of life.
Absolutely. So there's also criticism about the movement, you know, not going to be able to like achieve its stated goals. But I think what is interesting about how at the core there is, what I see you advocating for is patriotism, is principled action, is thinking about the bigger picture, you know, and putting oneself forth for something that we, you know, believe in, rather than thinking about you know, what is the most likely, you know, chance that we have. So thinking about this, regardless of the outcome of the 2020 election, which is a bet at this point for all of us, what do you think is the value of getting involved aggressively in this movement, besides what specifically happens on November 3rd?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because the proposal has always had 2 components. One is an emergency plan for the current election, and the other is the larger recognition that what unites us is far greater and more important than what divides us, and that is being lost by virtue of various processes, you know, a failure of sense making, which I think Stoa is very deliberately built to counteract. So those processes are destructive of many things. Most centrally is the recognition that we are actually in the same boat, and we are dependent on our recognition of that fact to continue. So, you know, we can talk about Unity 2020, the plan for this election, and we can talk about the overarching dynamic of unity, what I would call the unity movement. And I would say the former is a manifestation of the latter, but the latter is the much more important fact.
Great. So can you talk a little bit more about Unity? You know, we're here for Unity 2020, but what is the Unity movement, and what is the broader plan beyond even just the next month of organizing for the election? What's the big picture here?
Well, so the first thing to say is that I announced this proposal on Joe Rogan, and people just started showing up, which was in and of itself telling, right? There was a great hunger for somebody to speak to something beyond politics. And I think there was a second piece to it, which was, if I was a centrist by nature, then it wouldn't be very interesting that I was advocating for something that sidelined the duopoly by navigating the space between it. But because I'm actually a radical, people heard somebody putting aside their own ideology in favor of something more important, and it caused many of them to do the same thing. So I would say the most telling feature is that we have this large network of volunteers, people who are spending a tremendous amount of time on the Unity project, and they're very good folks. And we gather and we talk about what to do, and we scratch our heads over all of the twists and turns of 2020. And the fact is, I couldn't tell you which side of the aisle most of them are on. I actually just don't know, because it is such an unimportant fact in the context of people who have gathered together in a patriotic effort to save the Republic, that it just doesn't come up.
That's beautiful. The other thing that you've been doing, which is organizing all of this within the context of a pandemic. So all of these, other ways of kind of, rallying political support, of having big events and, having speakers and having all of these people coming together and being in the energy of a movement are not accessible to you. And so you've been relying very heavily on online platforms. And I know that you've had difficulty getting your message through on Twitter. Can you talk about that? What's going on with Twitter and the censorship that's happening there?
Sure. So first of all, I would say that the constraints that come along with COVID are a mixed bag, because on the one hand, it does mean that there are lots of things we would like to do that we can't. On the other hand, it has put everybody in the frame of mind of breaking whatever rules they thought accompanied what must take place in the context of a campaign or anything else. And, people are figuring out new ways to exist. And some of that is counterproductive, but I think in large measure, just the fact that we all have to think consciously about how to interact rather than be on autopilot is very productive. With respect to the platforms, this is also revealing just how much power they have, not only over whether or not we have access and can talk to our followers and attract new ones, but how we think, right? Because the hidden feature of these things are the algorithms at their core that actually adjust what it is that comes through your feed, and which voices are amplified and which ones are dampened. And so what we ran into in the context of Twitter is actually fascinating. The first thing I'll say about it is that we categorize it inside the movement as the flack you get when you're over the target. In other words, the fact that we're getting this pushback is not good. The pushback is dangerous. But the fact that we are getting it is an indication that we've struck a nerve. And that's something that if we weren't doing it, we would have to wonder if we were on a pointless mission. So what happened was we had an account that was the central distribution point for information about Unity. It was the Articles of Unity account on Twitter. And we advanced a hashtag on the last day of the Republican convention, "Just Say No to Donald and Joe." And we broadcasted over that channel, and our vast network of volunteers broadcast the hashtag, and it spread. And actually, we succeeded in getting that hashtag to trend. Next thing we knew, our account was suspended. No indication of why. Many of our detractors, who have accused us of all kinds of things, were crowing on Twitter about having reported us for various malfeasance, including being Russian bots. And we were unable to get anything official out of Twitter about what it was that they were claiming we had done. But back channel, we were told that we had registered something like 50 fake accounts in order to amplify the hashtag. Now, that did not ring true to us, but because it's a large volunteer organization, we had to check very thoroughly to make sure there was nothing that we were unaware of that some overzealous volunteer had engaged in. After a week of exhaustive interviews of people who were part of our movement and checking everything that was possible to check, it became very clear that whatever Twitter thought had happened had not. And we filed an appeal, and we have heard nothing back, just silence. I should also point out that in the early phases of the suspension, it was impossible to post a link to our website. No person on Twitter could link to our website. If you attempted it, the tweet did not go through, and you got a message that said that the website might contain harmful information. Now, mind you, this is a group of patriots attempting to escape the duopoly who are resolutely non-ideological and above politics. Now, Twitter could have many opinions about that, but the idea that it feels entitled to block other people from posting links to our website tells you something about the arrogance inside the organization. So I'm not sure exactly what we can do about any of this because, of course, the platforms have a tremendous amount of discretion. They dodge and weave between the interpretations that they are publishers and they are platforms, taking the advantages of both positions and the disadvantages of neither. And unfortunately, they effectively own what is now the public square through pure technological accident. And that means that we have no ability to reach each other without their okay. And anyway, it's a very serious concern that we ought to focus on collectively, irrespective of where we find ourselves in the political dialogue. A threat to speech that comes in the form of mysterious algorithms and unaccountable judges is simply unacceptable.
Yeah, that's deeply concerning. Has the Unity movement or Unity 2020 integrated this experience and made it part of the platform itself to talk about tech and media involvement in our political discourse?
You know, I would say we're in touch with many of the people you would imagine we should talk to about this in terms of figuring out how to integrate it into the movement. I would say it actually points to the larger question you asked before. Unity is a movement about obstacles to good governance. So there are many things that are obstacles to good governance. Corruption is one. The perverse incentives that accompany the platforms that allow us to talk to each other is another. And we effectively oppose all such things. And let me give you a modern example so you have a better sense of what I'm talking about. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death creates a number of problems. In addition to being just simply very sad, it raises the specter that an election that many people already expect to be contested might run into an additional hazard, which is to say a court of 8 can deadlock 50-50, whereas a court of 9 cannot. And so her absence means that we might be faced with a situation in which the Supreme Court has to rescue the Republic and is incapable of doing so. So in that context, it seems patriotically true that we should do everything. All those who view the survival of the Republic as paramount should seek to seat a proper justice as quickly as possible. The president should nominate someone who is not divisive, and the Senate should speed their confirmation so that at the point we reach the election, we have all the tools available to save ourselves from some sort of an ambiguous and dangerous outcome. So in the Unity movement, I feel we would be wise to advocate such a thing. We don't regard that as political. Now, many on the left will regard it as political because they see blocking the nomination as their obligation in light of what happened in 2016. But we see it differently, and we are very likely to advocate for the rapid seating of a good justice in short order.
So you have just over a month before the election. How are you going to use this very precious time to accelerate the movement and to grow interest? And what are you going to do?
Well, if I can be candid with you, I think we are in the following predicament. So were it true that upon announcing this, a groundswell had emerged, we could have drafted our candidates and we could have imposed on the parties that have ballot access to partner with us. And that was the plan. Now, we saw very good growth, but we did not see a groundswell. In fact, I think many people are still traumatized by the long abusive relationship that they've had with the duopoly and find themselves sitting on the fence, maybe rooting for us, but not willing to say out loud that they're actually entertaining the possibility that we could do something. So in that light, the path to the White House has become pretty unlikely. Now, it could still happen, right? We still have the debates ahead of us, and both the major party candidates are rather old. We're talking about two septuagenarians. We don't know what will happen in these debates, but it is possible that something will cause a shift in the electorate where suddenly one side will realize that its ticket is not actually viable and it will fear the election of the other. That could put this plan in motion, right? There are actually pathways to the election of the unity ticket right up to the point of the election. But that would require something of historic proportions to unfold in very short order. Absent such a thing, I would say the focus has to be on the movement going forward. And I think we are in grave jeopardy in the short term. I personally am, I hesitate to use the term frightened, but I don't think there's really a good alternative. I'm frightened about what's going to happen if the election is anything but clear. I'm frightened that one side or the other will not accept the results, that violence will occur, and that it will further deepen the divide that is threatening us. And so, in some sense, I'm not sure we have till 2024, but I would say the odds are better than 50-50 that we will make it to 2024. There's nothing on the horizon that suggests it's going to cure the basic problem of divisive partisan politics, and therefore we have to be ready for next time. And frankly, with this much run up, we can be in a much better position where, for example, we don't have to impose on third parties for ballot access. If this is the path forward, then we could gain ballot access through the normal mechanisms, which I should point out the duopoly has made onerous for reasons of self-protection.
Right. So we're about to move over to the audience Q&A. Is there anything else that you want to just say before we move into the dynamic part of the live podcast?
Well, I should say I feel a little weird with you asking these questions. I don't think people fully grasp that to say that you were a student of mine is really, this does not properly characterize how well we know each other, because you, in addition to being my student for a number of years, were present on the trip that my wife and I ran to Ecuador in our second to last year of teaching at Evergreen. So we've been in the field together. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, you and I were almost killed together in the same storm as a result of a sudden tree fall, right? So anyway, it's good to see you, Raven. Anyway, I just feel that context is necessary to know, because I don't know, it'd be weird to imagine that we just sort of we're in the same classroom.
No, I mean, yes, we've been through a lot together.
Yep.
Very true. Yeah, and it's changed my life to know you. That's definitely the case. Yes. Oh, okay. And with that, let us move to the Q&A. So if you have a question for Bret, go ahead and throw it in the chat. This is not the opportunity to debate him, so you get your question and then a follow-up question if you feel called to do that. And we're going to begin with David Swedlow. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hey, thanks, Bret. Yeah, I've been following along, so I know that you've reached out to the Libertarian Party's Jo Jorgensen, and it's understandable that she's reluctant to hand you the Unity 2020 seat for the nomination that she received. But is it conceivable that the Green Party and the Libertarian parties and the Unity movement could get together for some way to combine forces to make a third party option really viable, so that whether it's a debate between them that would show intelligence distinct from the duopolies candidates, or some other method where they could, in a sense, combine efforts and say, Unity would support the Libertarians if some contest showed that among the three of them, the one that had the best chances of winning would be any one of those three?
Great question. I would say there are a lot of ways it could go. So to our mind, we were not exactly asking the Libertarians and or Greens and or any other of the third-party options to hand us their ballot access. We were hoping that they would recognize this as a real opportunity, because what happens with the third parties is they attain the status of historical footnote at best. At worst, they get enough of the vote to be blamed for whoever is elected. And in this case, what we were suggesting was that if they were to step aside for one election cycle, that there would be a lot of value for their long-term well-being, and the value would come in a couple of different forms. First, for any party that gets 5% of the vote, there are federal funds available in a future election. Had one of the parties achieved 5% in a past election, that would have been worth $20 million in this case. So we're talking about a large bit of fuel that was available to a third party that had the vision to partner with us. Also, our vote that we held between our 9 possible tickets was a ranked choice vote, which is evidence of our commitment to the idea of ranked choice voting. And ranked choice voting is probably the key proposal to increase the influence of third parties in our governance. So what we were hoping was that they would recognize that this was a long-term investment and that in effect they were making a trade rather than engaging in charity. Now, I don't actually know what the conversation sounds like on the inside of these parties. I do know that we are in contact with people in the Libertarian organization. We had Justin Amash on our most recent campfire, and so I think there is a kind of dawning awareness in these circles that there's a larger game theoretic puzzle to be solved. Now, as to the particular structure you lay out, I think there are some game theoretic problems with it. In other words, the Libertarians and the Greens, for example, because these are ideology-based parties, have to swallow a very bitter pill if they are to team up in order to defeat the duopoly, but are to empower something that is distant from themselves ideologically. That is probably not a viable structure, which is exactly why the Unity proposal looks the way it does. By being non-ideological, it allows those of us who recognize that the corruption in our system is the hazard to it serving our collective well-being. It allows us to gather together under one banner and not be compromised in so doing.
Just a quick follow-up, I think it's a yes or no. Is there just a sense that if it were to further the third-party option, could you see, I mean, obviously you can't guarantee anybody does anything, but could you see encouraging the Unity followers to back the Libertarians if there was some way that actually would be more viable for making third-party option viable this time?
Well, again, I think it's a larger game theoretic puzzle. What we will certainly do is we will advocate that people vote their conscience, to the extent that the argument is you mustn't consider voting for anything other than the major party options because you'll elect the greater evil. I would remind you, once upon a time, Mitt Romney was the greater evil. That tells you how dumb this argument is, right? People are now begging for a Mitt Romney-like figure. They're wishing that such a person would step in and save us from the absurd choice that the duopoly has stuck us with. But, you know, in the past, this was an unthinkable fate. So that's the argument. The argument is false. People should vote their conscience. And if they did, we wouldn't be stuck with this structure.
Thank you. We're going to go to Paul Dunscombe. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, so from my perspective, it seems, and I'm sure a lot of others, it seems like the two tribes live in sort of two different realities, which to me seems fundamentally different than having two different ideologies. How does unity address this epistemological crisis? And second, how does the answer not just be a split the difference where neither side is happy?
All right. That is multifaceted, but you're exactly right. Now, I would argue that the distinct and maybe more importantly, unreconcilable narratives exist in service of a structure that does not wish to be displaced by analysis and its logical consequences. So the two tribes do live in what I see as an almost reciprocal pair of realities. So the way I used to say this is the Fox News viewer sees the NPR listener as insane. The NPR listener regards the Fox News viewer as crazy, and they're both right, right? So they each see something in the other that is accurate and causes them not to pay attention. And what they don't see is the same distortion in themselves. And so first thing to say is those who have arrived at a unity orientation, and my guess is I'm looking at a screen full of people who have something like a unity orientation, that those people begin to recognize that the truth is not encapsulated in either place, that it has to be constructed a la carte because it is actually complex. So what are we doing about it? I think that's almost the wrong way to look at it. I would say many different projects aim to solve a piece of this puzzle. Unity 2020 aims to solve this puzzle in the political context, whereas Stoa is aiming to solve this in a social context. IDW aimed to solve it in a sense-making public context, close kin to Stoa maybe. But all of these things are attempts to bypass these game theoretic failures and bootstrap a superior alternative. And what I hope, above all else, is that all of these projects that aim to do that begin to recognize that they are each looking at one facet of the same gem. And to the extent that we do that, we become very powerful very quickly.
Great. Paul, do you have any kind of response? No, okay. Let us move to Blaine. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, let me just pull it up real fast. All right, I'm just gonna read all what I submitted. It says, instead of UBI, wouldn't earned universal income be a platform for unity? Basically, putting citizens would serve in the communities for X amount of time or X way to earn UBI seems to be two birds, one stone. They're saying defund the police, but also have citizens service police, so policing gets more resources to focus on education and training, but also quote unquote defund, as in put back into the communities through the citizens earning their UBI.
So I think this is a very good, this shows us an important fork in the conversation. So I personally agree with you about what I would call participation income as likely superior to universal basic income. But that conversation really has no place in the unity layer, right? Because as much as I think that's a desirable thing and that all reasonable people should probably be considering some proposal in this neighborhood as the solution to a large and growing problem, that's my personal political belief, right? What I'm hoping, what the unity proposal is built around, is the idea that if you put two patriots in a room from different sides of the political spectrum and they hash this out in the interest of the nation, that they will arrive at a good answer, right? If the good answer is something like participation income, I'm hoping that that will be shown by the process. But I do think it is important to separate our own political desires and beliefs from the effort to rid the system of the corruption that prevents a rational set of beliefs from guiding us.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, from that platform, I kind of view it as also the members serving through the Earn UBI program could also be kind of giving the people Big Brother into all of the elements of service to, because let's say if you have a physical disability, it can only serve through advocation. You would still be able to keep eye to make sure there's no like corruption in certain departments or anywhere. And the
Wayne, I'm going to cut in here. Thank you so much for your question, but we're going to go to Megan's question.
okay, thank you.
Megan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thanks very much. I was curious by when you said that the power that Twitter has is a technological accident. There's a term that I learned here on the Stoa that I think I was really looking for in life, which is the blue church. And it looks to me like both Twitter and Facebook are branches of that blue church. They are very specific in the angle that they push. I'm noticing the flags that say learn how voting by mail is safe and secure. It's a very, very specific message that those people are pushing. So I was wanting to know what's your basis for attributing this effect to being an accident, and what would be your opinion on the implication of the possibility either that it's an accident or that it's actually a branch of something that is organized?
That's interesting, because I see exactly the same bias that you do. I do think Silicon Valley is it is in alignment with the blue church, but the way I would say it is that Silicon Valley is utilizing one half of the duopoly to advance its interests. And so the reason that we have two parties in the duopoly is that there are actually competing interests within the elites. And the elites, the rent seekers, basically own all of the power. This is why policy has almost no relationship to the desire of the electorate. The electorate is a body that has to be persuaded to award power, which is then monetized and peddled by these two forces, but they're peddling to different constituencies, right? So, it might be that the blue church, as you put it, is in alignment with alternative energy properties, and that the red religion is defending fossil fuels, and that those two things are in competition with each other. But the fact is, the corruption that comes from both of these things pushing their interests in this pugilistic context, it's corrosive to us serving our interests, which would have representatives who don't have a dog in the fight talking about what energy policy should be going forward. So the leap in your question is, did these platforms have an alignment with the blue church, or did they find the blue church, the Democratic Party, as the locale through which they could corrupt the system in their interest? And I think it is very much likely to be the latter. The historical accident is just the fact of the amazing rate of growth that accompanied the innovations in social media and search. Those things empowered a group of companies that started from nothing to dominate this entire piece of landscape, so that we cannot, for example, simply opt for something that functions like Twitter but doesn't take its view of censorship, right? We are left with either accepting Twitter's view of censorship or opting out of all Twitter-like phenomena. And let's put it this way: the hypothesis that this is something more than a historical accident is something that would require some evidence, and I haven't seen it yet. It looks to me like a much more natural story of platforms finding a mechanism to serve their interests in a governmental structure that is prone to facilitate corruption.
I'll just add a quick follow-up. I'm just wondering about the sort of implication of the equal basis of the blue and the red in this case. Just my perspective on this is maybe a little unusual because I'm a New Zealander, and we don't have red-flavored mainstream news. We only have blue-flavored mainstream news. Washington Post, New York Times are the outlets that are constantly repeated in our media. And there seems to be absolutely no equivalent here. And anyone who gets their narrative in the mainstream media of the the Great Southern Bolt Hole over here seems to me to be, I mean, it's a very superlative achievement, which I guess makes me more inclined to believe that it's not some kind of accident. But sorry, I guess that's not really a question. I'll let someone else take over.
I'm going to read this question on behalf of Drew Buckmiller. With the stated concern of gridlock in the Supreme Court with an even number of justices, how does the same concern relate to the proposal of operating under consensus between the two people on the unity ticket?
Yep, great question. So first of all, the unity proposal is built to take our constitutional structure and use it in a new way without having to alter it, right? This is a model that I would suggest we need to get better at, right? Having a constitutional convention to fix your structure may seem like the right move, but it could end in disaster. Whereas doing something that is constitutional but unforeseen doesn't carry the same hazard. In this case, you elect a president and vice president. They informally agree to govern by consensus. And in the case that they can't reach a consensus, the president is the president, right? So you could regard that as a major asymmetry, but the agreement also has them reversing roles after 4 years. And so even if there is a slight bias within any 4-year period, it tends to reverse over time. And this maintains balance. Is it perfect? No. But if you found two good people, and the two people that we found for the ticket we hope to draft, Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw, they actually turn out to be friends. And although ideologically they're quite far apart, they clearly have the characteristics necessary for them to discuss what should be done in a humane and decent way with each other. They also both are clear patriots. And so the interests of the nation would presumably loom larger for them than their own personal desires.
Great, thank you. Chris C., would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, Bret, curious to know what the unity movement stance is on local and state politics.
Well, so far, we have taken no action with respect to anything down ballot. That's because we got started very late in light of a national emergency that surrounded the presidential ticket. Long term, those races are obviously important. And what I would say is we would take the same overarching posture, which is that somebody has to advocate for the well-being, for the patriotic middle. Unfortunately, in the context of some of these state processes, a mechanism for balance is harder to build, right? The presidential ticket, because of the way president and vice president are elected, allowed us to use this proposal. You have to be cleverer to make it work in other contexts that don't lend themselves to that balance.
Thank you very much.
All right, let me see here. Listen, would you like to ask the question?
Sure, thank you. I'm here.
Great.
I was pulling over. Okay, hi, thank you, Brett. My question is, do you see any glimpses yet of other projects or campaigns being started, initiated by the Unity 2020 team or movement, in addition to the political campaign that has started it all?
Well, let me understand your question. You're asking if people inside the Unity movement are starting their own initiatives?
Yeah, other projects, initiatives, even if it's just a glimpse or a sense of something that might be created or produced by those individuals as a result of this.
There's lots of discussion inside the movement about what to do and how to move forward. I think the thing that troubles me, and this isn't the first time I've seen it, so you all are presumably familiar with Game B. Okay, so to the extent that you are familiar with Game B was at a time back in 2013-ish, it was a group of people who met to discuss the question of how to transition civilization to something more effective, less fragile, and more humane. In any case, early in that process, we had a fair amount of discussion over whether or not we were the only effort to discuss that systematically, the only people meeting, or were there 1,000 rooms of people meeting, having parallel discussions? And the answer adjusts things rather radically. If Game B had been one of 1,000 groups targeted at that same puzzle, then in some sense, only one has to succeed, right? If Game B was the only one of those, then it had to succeed. And those, knowing the answer to that causes you to play the game differently. I think we discovered over time that in the English-speaking world, there were not 1,000 Game Bs. In fact, the tendency was for those things that began to show signs of thinking in this direction, that they tended to coalesce. And that's probably not a good thing. Probably from the point of view of our overall well-being, we should want to see many separate projects that do not fail together. Now, in the case of Unity, again, I would imagine in the context of a presidential election with two unforgivably bad tickets, that you would imagine lots of people would be generating alternative mechanisms, some of them more cogent than others, but you would expect to see lots of projects like that. And we saw very little that was new. So that worries me. What that tells me is that somehow we've gotten into the habit of thinking this is impossible. And at the same time, I would argue that logically it is necessary. So if we all imagine that that which is necessary is actually impossible and it paralyzes us so we don't do it, we're in serious trouble. So anyway, I'd love to see lots of other Unity-themed movements arise, and then we could talk about whether teaming up made sense, or honorably competing with each other made sense, or some hybrid of the two. But at the moment, what I see is we tried it, and we don't see a lot of other attempts, and that is probably not good news.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to James Baker.
Hi, thanks. So this is a question about polarization and maybe avoiding, but more recovering. So thinking forward to maybe 2024 or down the road, if and when unity is embraced a bit more by one party than the other, what I see happening there is then instantly it would become part of the polarized frame. Like it would get polarized in the frame of everybody from both tribes. What would the strategy then be to kind of recover from that?
To be very careful what you agree to, right? So yes, I can imagine that at some point the major parties might realize that they had something to gain by capturing unity, and unity has to be uncapturable. And it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be willing to play ball with a major party, but the point is each choice has to be one that is safe to engage in and that is justified on its merits. So in essence, we would have to have the ability to pull one of the parties in the direction of the patriotic center in order for it to be worth even contemplating.
I guess my follow-up would be to relate this back to the general dynamic of third parties, and how to, like, you said something about like avoid being captured, but sorry, the impulse here, like if adopted by one side more than the other, like how do you avoid being captured when the thing that is the capturing is the frame of everybody in both tribes who is looking at this thing, and trying to decide whether it's something that they can trust to navigate that knife's edge third party route, or whether it just becomes part of the tribal warfare?
The answer is first principles thinking, right? If you are reasoning from first principles and your reasoning is robust, then you are not vulnerable to being lured into dangerous illogic. Now, you can still make an error, but the problem of capture arises when you're in a different modality, like one of negotiation, where you could surrender the piece that you need to hold because it seemed like you were making a trade that was valuable. So I would just say the unity movement mustn't do anything that doesn't make sense on its merits, independent of whether or not it's on offer.
Great, thank you. Rob Hart, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I'm scrolling back to find it. Hang on. So the offer from the major parties has never been worse, which means that the potential for a third party win has never been better. But 2/3 of Americans now agree that a third party is actually necessary. Kind of makes this moment one to leverage. Could unity do that by promising to reform elections themselves, such that third parties will have a viable future?
Well, in some sense, we're doing that. The one thing we haven't done is start a third party. At the moment, unity is a movement. Now, it might have to become a third party in order to accomplish that. But by setting it in motion as a movement, we retained options that I think were valuable, at least in this initial run-up. So from my perspective, I don't need it to be a third party. It could be a third party, and I could be comfortable with that. What I need is for something to fix the system so that it stops parasitizing us and putting us in jeopardy. And I think the statistics that you cite reflect the fact that a lot of people are of similar mind. So yes, the opportunity is absolutely immense, and it's much greater even than most people realize, because there is this huge group of non-voters. And there's a way in which non-voter has a kind of sound to it where we hear it as apathetic. But some of the people who don't vote are apathetic. Many of them are disaffected and are responding to the fact that the system does not react to their will. Those people can easily be brought back if something does become responsive. And in fact, we've seen 1/4 of our volunteers are people who weren't planning to vote in this election until unity. So it does mobilize people who were interested but not participating. And that group could actually make a third party or a movement the largest political force in the country very quickly.
Just a follow-up to that, since you mentioned that you don't have an interest in forming a third party, I actually feel that it may be more attractive to people because they don't feel that this party or this movement is seeking its own power, but rather seeking to empower all people. My thought would be that leveraging that very idea would allow more people to get on board. But you point to the thing that probably is the biggest obstacle to this, and that's that people don't believe it's possible. So if they were to reflect on just how great their numbers are, they might actually see the movement worthwhile.
Oh, exactly. And in a year like 2020, people's sense of what is and isn't possible is more or less incoherent, right? Because all this took, right? This could actually happen if people suspended their disbelief But the fact of democracy requires that anyway, right? We need people to go and vote in numbers large enough that their will is proportionally represented, even though those people know that their vote is almost certainly not going to change any outcome, right? So they have already suspended their disbelief just simply to participate. And all we're suggesting is actually suspend your disbelief in a different direction. Something you've been told can't happen actually can happen, and the people who told you it couldn't happen have a perverse incentive to lead you to be paralyzed.
Great. And Aaron, would you like to bring us home with your final question?
Gladly, Raven, thank you. Bret, you mentioned that Unity 2020, the IDW, and the Stoa might represent different facets of the same jewel. How can these different facets best support each other? How should a platform like the Stoa, what should a platform like the Stoa do in the next month? And how might it evolve between now and 2024?
Great question. First thing to do is just figure out whether you agree with the premise, right? If you agree with the premise that these things are manifestations of the same impulse to make things better, right, to escape the game theoretic traps of our current system, then I would say, first of all, spreading that message is key, right? People, we are wasting our effort by being divided. You know, part of it's useful division, right? You need to have people focused on a problem that's tractable. And if we're all focused on the total problem, it's not tractable. But to recognize that we are fellow travelers empowers us greatly. And let me just say, you know, it's not just IDW, Stoa, Game B, Unity. It's also the makers movement. It's open source, right? It's all of these different attempts to do something basically to restructure incentives so that things work. It's probably the crypto movement as well. So recognizing the connection is key. Spreading the message so that people who are, you know, have their blinders on in their corner of this realize that they are in some sense part of something larger, and that it doesn't take very much to, you know, append to your toolkit, well, maybe I'm a programmer and I'm involved in the open source movement, but I'm also subject to the political will of the electorate, and there is a parallel project over in electoral space. So whatever effort I put into thinking about politics, I'm going to tune into that. Or from the point of view of sense making about the world, I'm going to tune into channels that seem to be dedicated to breaking these toxic narratives that so many people are being jerked around by. So I'm not sure that I've given you a very clear answer, but the recognition that these things are connected, to the extent that one can spread that message so that people who are likely to have ears to hear because they're in one of these other projects can begin to tune in and recognize that they may have been, you know, missing a solution to a problem they weren't even paying attention to. Those things, I think, will have a very positive effect in the long term.
Great, thank you. And we have reached our hour mark. So before we close, Bret, where can we find you? Do you have any final words that you want to leave us with?
Sure. Let's just say this has been a great conversation. I do feel like I have stepped into a parallel universe of fellow travelers, and that's always a very reassuring thing to discover. People can find they can find our website for Unity 2020 at articlesofunity.org. If you want updates on Twitter, you can follow my Twitter account at Bret Weinstein. Bret has one T. You can find my wife and me doing bi-weekly podcasts on the Dark Horse podcast on YouTube or whatever your favorite podcast app is. And maybe that's it.
Excellent. I think I can speak for everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This was a really great conversation. And we hope to see you again at the Stoa.
Thank you. I really had a great time, and it was nice seeing you again. And anyway, be well all. let's keep fighting the good fight.
Absolutely. Great. And Peter, I don't know where you are, but do you want to promote
Yes.
any future events?
Yes. So Bret, Raven, thank you for having that dialogue, and thank you everyone for your excellent questions. Some upcoming events. Our boy Tyson has an event coming up. Tyson, if you can unmute yourself and plug that.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. Thanks again, Bret. Thank you, Raven. Tonight at 8:30 Eastern is Flowing with Unknowingness, where we practice deepening our relationship with uncertainty and exercising our trust muscles through freestyle spoken word and freestyle rap. Imagine collective dialogue backed by hip hop beats. That's what it is. So we'd love to see you there. And if you are feeling a little bit nervous about it, I would just say like all the more reason to show up and enjoy it. So see you there.
Tyson's inventing a new genre of sense-making rap, so must check that out. Tomorrow we have Surrendered Leadership with John Thompson. He's from Circling Europe, and so we're going to get our kind of authentic relating circling on. That's at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And Susan Blackmore, mimetic scholar, she's coming in Thursday, I believe, Conscious of Selfish Genes and Memes Machines. That's September 24th at 12 p.m. Eastern time. We got tons of events. Check out our website. A lot of exciting action here. And if you'd like to support us while we steal the culture, you can do so on Patreon. That being said, Bret, Raven, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Be well, everybody.